Hello and welcome to another episode of Political Agenda brought to you by New Narrative. My name is PJ Thum and today we're interviewing Ryaihanny, who is a legal professional who is going to talk to us about Islam and abolition. But before that, I am wearing a blue and white batik shirt sitting in front of a big bookcase, and my pronouns are he, him. Political Agenda is brought to you by New Narrative, which is a movement for democracy in Southeast Asia, and we are entirely 100% member supported. So if you like what we do and if you enjoy this podcast, please do consider joining us as a member at newnarrative.com/join or donating at newnarrative.com/donate. Okay, so we're here to talk to Hani, who will be talking to us about Islam and abolition. But before we get to them, here is Sean Francis. How are you doing today, Sean?
Yeah, I'm doing really good. Really excited to get into this episode. Prison abolition, abolitionist politics is something that's seen a major resurgence in recent years, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. But we're here today to talk about Islam and abolition, which is, I think, extremely interesting and far more localized. So I'm very interested to get into all of that. But before we do, hi, my name is Sean Francis. I'm wearing a grey t-shirt and my pronouns are he, him. So, Ryaihanny Sahrom, Hani, can you tell us more about yourself? What are you wearing and what are your pronouns?
Alright, hi, thanks a lot for having me here. I am Ryaihanny. You can refer to me as Hani. I'm wearing a white top and my pronouns are she, they.
Alright, so Ryaihanny, let's just get right into it. Can you tell us more about yourself? How did you get interested in activism, interested in abolitionist politics? What led you to this point?
Alright, so I actually am studying out in immigration law, specializing in the APAC region. But before this, I was working as a civil servant, and I dealt with criminal litigation for a few years. And I write for different publications on gender and labor politics with a focus on social justice issues. So these concern marginalized genders. I recently published a chapbook as well, which is a raw poetry that explores the internal conflict of identities, racism, of love and grief, in the time of upheaval and precarity in the society. So that were actually written when I was living in London before having to move back to Singapore due to COVID as well. I actually had to stop a lot of my organizing work that I have done in the past because I was a civil servant. So how I describe myself and what led me to believing in abolition as well is because I pretty much exist as someone who is neurodivergent with ADHD and dyslexia, despite being a writer, a queer Muslim who is also proud of both my identities, and they are not a paradox, and I will continue to identify as both. So my late grandma and dad as well, they're indigenous to Pulau Sekijang Pelepah, which is also known as Lazarus Island. Were considered as Orang Pulau, who sort of got forcefully evicted off the island into mainland Singapore. And each time my late grandma spoke to me about it, we're constantly reminded of indigenous dispossession, which is inherently tied to racism in Singapore. And I believe that it is such an important part of my identity that shaped my politics and shape a lot of my political inclination in terms of being sort of a critique of this exploitative system that continue to plunder and colonize and devalue labor. So getting into my abolitionist politics as well, I feel my initial whole political understanding, it sort of has been framed around the brutal response to 9/11, one that definitely elicits more resentment and retaliatory violence as well, and it produces more and more instability. I mean, we're old enough to remember, when race baiting Muslims was so easy after 9/11, and it was so acceptable as well. There was a time where people could all easily assume that all terroristic acts we see in the media and on TV is just because of radical Islam. And when I was a young teen, like I remember having to debate not all Muslims are terrorists, and but all terrorists are Muslims in school. And I realized that it was simply racist. It was I was being like subjected to a lot of microaggressions, and my Muslim as actually had to like argue for that. So there was a lot of this righteous anger with no place to go, and there were rampant like Islamophobia and stereotype about Muslims, about anti-Muslim sentiments, and how Islam is always being portrayed as this big old like archaic violent religion. And this religion is riddled with a lot of like harsh ideas of punishment, of inhumane like punitivity that just scare people off the religion. And for me, as an abolitionist Muslim, like Islam is still one of my root of my politics, the way I understand the world. Definitely I celebrate the model and the ethos of the Prophet, his family, and the Imams. And dare I say, actually, Islam is actually far more focused on restorative justice than punitive, which is pretty much like the topic of the conversation we're having today.
Yeah. So the topic of conversation today, really, I mean, for everybody out there, right, comes from this text or this article that you wrote that got translated into a series of graphics by Beyond the Hijab, which is titled "Why I Believe Prison Abolition is an Islamic Issue," right? And what I'm very, I mean, before we get into the intricacies and the intersections of Islam and prison abolition, maybe can you share with us what's your central thesis on abolition, on prison abolition? Because there have been many writers that have talked about prison abolition, and each of them formulate it slightly differently, right? So I'm quite interested, how would you formulate it, and what is your central thesis on abolition?
All right, so I believe that prison abolition is just this radical idea that people are not supposed to be caged. It's wrong, it's egregious, it's inhumane, and people are allowed the freedom to do what they want. And also like it's beneficial for us to firstly like unpack what carcerality is. We have to move beyond like this carceral approach of punishment. So it is more towards like community healing. It's more towards people helping one another and believing that people can actually do better than what they have behaved in the past, and people are redeemable in terms of that, and we can extend this to strangers as well. So yeah.
Okay, so I mean, so now that we've kind of clarified, right, that your position on prison abolition is one that seeks, I think, maybe not in such a direct way to completely take away or abolish prisons, but to, you know, as you put it yourself, abolish the structures that cause people to resort to crime in the first place. So now that we've kind of clarified that, I think the big question I want to ask here is, why choose an Islamic perspective to engage with the idea of prison abolition? Why would a secular approach not suffice for you? Or what do you think can be brought to the table by bringing in Islam here?
All right, so if I could just like briefly touch upon like the part of Islamic history in lieu of like this month being the month of Muharram, which is the first month of the Islamic calendar. So it is pretty apt because there was a very significant event that happened in 680 AD, which is the event of Karbala, the city in Iraq where many Muslims, millions and millions of Muslims actually mourned the martyrdom of the grandson of the Prophet. And Karbala occurred because of like unjust systems were being held by unjust rulers. So this was an abolition movement. It was, it continues to be an abolition movement. And abolition is just this act or action of abolishing a system, a practice, an institution. So when the tyrant of the time, Yazid ibn Muawiyah, he came into power, systems of injustice were rife. So surveillance was the norm over those who disobeyed the family's rule. Slavery was the norm, even though Islam actually brought rules and regulations to humanize workers and to free slaves. Exploitation of women's bodies was the norm, even though Islam sort of brought dignity to women's experience in this world. So this form of greed, I'd say, it fuels slavery, it fuels modern day slavery. and a surveillance system. It fuels objectification and dehumanization of women, and Islamophobia and racism. But Islam actually, to me as an abolitionist Muslim, it provides the roadmap for that holistic abolition. So this spiritual leader at the time, like, he fought so that a lot of like generations after them could benefit from their spiritual state and worldly practices. Definitely the systems and societies that were protested like against at Karbala in this city Iraq are the same systems and societies that are still present to this day. Like, they may have different facades, but they still dominate. And to me, it's very intertwined, like Islamic abolition with anti-oppressive politics, because mercy and humanity, I believe, is just they are just like so central to Islam. They are antithetical to like ideas of tortures and punishments, even though a lot of people have this perception, oh, Islam, oh, hudud law and stuff like that. And it's just one, because the Quran itself, like, it literally tells us to like pay zakat, which entails just like donating a certain portion of your wealth for charitable causes to free people. And we know a lot of like Muslims who have been doing like abolition work since the 7th century. Freeing slaves was one of the best ways to get free in the afterlife, in terms of like the Muslims' perspective of it. And Islam does a lot of work in prisons to like liberate the hearts and minds as well in the hard time. So with me, definitely, because we are all flawed human beings, and apart from like having to deeply reckon with our own behavior and be accountable for the harm that we may have enacted as well, like upon others, words and agreements, and we are also like responsible for other human beings and creations, so we are accountable for them too. And where we have like unjustly acted towards them, like subjecting people to like torture and violence, these all violate a very like social religious responsibility and sensibility in Islam. So being acutely aware for me that human beings are flawed, it made me feel more compassionate. And I'm definitely not under the illusion that we cannot be like disappointed. You know, like, I believe people can take on good actions leading to better behavior. Yeah.
I'm okay. So let's back up a little bit and get sort of to the root of the issue, right? How did we get to a point, right, broadly speaking, not just in Singapore, but I think globally as well, and especially with the US, right, where these kinds of carceral logics have become so widespread, right? Has this always been the norm, right? In the early days of Islam, in its founding years, right? Was this the case? You know, is the carceral logic something that's universal and timeless, or is it something that has become very entrenched and it's been developed over the years, right?
Okay,
Basically,
so
my question
yeah.
is, how did we get to this point?
Okay, so it's always been our human, like, we have a lot of like carceral impulses, because we believe that the world is unjust, and then we have no other ideas apart from like wanting to like punish people through like punitivity actions. And it's always been the system, like, from the beginning of time, and it's time for us to actually like unlearn a lot of this mindset and behavior. And I guess like it's beneficial to just like first unpack and break down like what carceral or like carcerality is, which is obviously this entails a lot of like punitive orientations and the ways our ideas and our thinking are influenced by practices of imprisonment and policing, which have been practiced like since the beginning of time as well. Because of like prisons and policing, they're so deeply infect our ideas and thinking about addressing harm, that we truly think a lot of the times like conflict or being wrong and accountability is all like necessitates punishment. And for me, like litigating who deserve like mercy and who deserve mercy from like these very oppressive structures, this very inhumane prison system, it also necessitates the idea that some people actually deserve to remain caged. And it's something that I I wrote about in the Beyond the Hijab article, which is that when you actually treat people's freedom as a subject matter to be debated, like you not only accept the legitimacy of a very heavily like violent system, but you also like justify the dehumanization inherent within it. And globally, as you say, like we do cage our most marginalized people, like the revolutionary and prison scholar Angela Davis as well. She has mentioned that prison has become our response of our very first resort, to so many of like society's problems, from poverty, from homelessness to mental illness to like drug addiction, and overwhelmingly it's poor people and minorities who are caged. And it's good that in recent time, like many people understand there needs to be a change, and many of the time like these changes being advocated are really exciting as well. But a lot of like mainstream reforms assume that for the right people, like whoever they are, like prisons actually work. Cages actually keep us safe, which I find to be quite a flaw in the mainstream like prison reform, because there's this idea that if we just change a bit here and there, prisons can become less violent, and if we just change a few things, like the correctional system can indeed function as like a correctional system. So there was a lot of like this assumption that cages, like I said, like it can keep us safe, but reality is that many people coming out of prisons, many people coming out of like these human cages are rearrested within a few years as well, and it's not correctional, so you're not tackling like the root of the harm as well. It is a very vicious cycle, and the cycle also like functions. The very same people are targeted like again and again and again, and policing is grounded in a lot of like racism and classism. So many of us have I say like at some point of time in our lives like committed an act that could be considered a crime, but it's marginalized people who are targeted, who are like police, who are arrested for a lot of these acts. So policing is the gateway to prison, and so this systematic racial targeting, it ensures a steady supply of like people flowing into a prison. And another way that this functions is just that many of like people who commit the acts we refer to as crimes as well, like they are doing so like in the service of their own survival sometimes. So like I don't know about everyone, but I think like shoplifting staple food from like cold storage because you don't have like any food, because you're starving, is not really like a major crime at all, because end of the day it is still a very socially constructed category with like not really an objective meaning behind, but a variation of like contested definitions and power relations. So Mariam Katba, who is this prison abolitionist scholar and activist as well, like she has said something which goes along like not everything that's criminal is harmful, and not everything that's harmful is criminal. So it is a socially constructed set of norms, and it defines like what society decides for itself that they will criminalize, created by people like years and years and years ago, and decades ago, but we just like keep adding on to that criminal code. So it does nothing to address poverty or economic injustice. Actually people coming out of prisons, like I said, have very few like resources and even fewer like opportunities than they did going in. Plus they are emerging from prison with a felon label, and this label like make them less accessible to like secure jobs and like housing and education, and very often like they return to like a lot of criminalized acts in order to survive again. So it is this cycle of hurt people in a way, but this isn't to like obfuscate accountability or pathologize trauma in a way as an inevitable determinant of abuse, but because there are a lot of like survivors of violence who don't and would never inflict like violence on others, who won't commit what we sort of like categorize as crimes. But when we actually think about the people who are incarcerated for violent crimes, often we don't think about the fact that most of them have been victims of violence in the past. So prison does not help people heal, it just continues this cycle of violence.
If I can just add on, I think the one of the examples you brought up about not everything that's harmful is criminal is harmful is actually very important. It's a very important point for people to realize that we are governed by certain values and institutions and structures, which affect how the system behaves, how we think, right? And I think for me, the best example is always the fact that if you take something from your workplace, even if something very small, right? Could be as small as like a pen or something. Your employer, the capitalist, has a right to call the police on you. But if your employer withholds your salary, which could be thousands of dollars, you don't have the right to call the police on them. You're sent to arbitration, you have to go through all these mechanisms to talk things through, to negotiate, right? So there is a very clear power imbalance in society, and there are values deeply laden into the system, which we need to interrogate and unpack. And the problem is, when it comes to that, first of all, obviously in Singapore, we can't talk about things openly, right? We're not allowed to. The system doesn't like debate. But second, we glorify colonialism. We talk about how colonialism was a good thing. But colonialism is fundamentally a violence, an act of violence on the population, on both a native indigenous population, the dispossession of land, as you talked earlier, but also the importation of people as property, right? And we should also somehow stop. I mean, we glorify, especially the Chinese community, glorify our coolie ancestors. They were slaves, they were indentured laborers. They're no different from Bangladeshis, Filipinos, all the migrant workers who come in today and who are ruthlessly exploited and sacrificed on the altar of capitalism, making money. But if we keep doing that, right, if we keep glorifying colonialism, our enslaved past, then we also we take on into ourselves this idea that it is okay, it is right to exercise violence on people. And to what end? Well, to make money. That's what Singapore was for. That's why the British founded Singapore, to make money, not to bring some sort of enlightenment. For all of Raffles, crazy ideas, and he had some ideas that were enlightened, but he was in Singapore like 30-40 days total. Overall, and for Raffles as well, Singapore was about making money. And so if we accept all of this and we say, hey, it's okay to conduct violence on our own population in order to make money, and we glorify that in the past, that then affects how we look at everything today, and it creates the whole logic of incarceration for us. It creates a whole system where if you're not an economically productive person, if you deviate from that at all, the state has the right to exercise violence on you to put you back in line. And that is a very deep-seated reason for the whole situation that we're in today.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you brought out. Definitely, it's about like power relations. It's about wealth. Like our current system, undoubtedly, like they make wealth and not safety the primary like determinant of whether someone is released while awaiting trial as well. Because like it's wild that there is also like a price tag to your freedom. And like according to the criminal procedure code, like the amount of like every bond executed as well, it must be fixed with due regard to the circumstances of the case as being sufficient to secure the attendance of the person arrested or like charged. So in other words, like the price of every single bond, like it depends on like the likelihood of like the accused attending court for his or her trial. But people remain locked up a lot of the times as well, like because they can't afford bail sometimes, and that's criminalizing like poverty. And it's wrong. Like bills are supposed to like exist to make sure like you show up at your court date, right? Like, so why is it like if you don't have money, like you can't get out? Like it's immoral, like it's egregious as well. So a lot of like this I would say horrible things happen in the world, a few carried out by like profoundly like very disturbed people. Sometimes people would say like some irredeemably like so. I always find it interesting until like the amount of energy the media spends on a lot of these stories, and how it shapes like our views and the very like necessity of prisons in a way to stop like all these bad people. So imagine if we also, in terms of like colonialism as well, like imagine if we indicted those who sent us to like decades of long wars against like incredibly impoverished sectors of the globe, that have been also like purposely underdeveloped by the international community, with the same vigor as we did these like sensational cases, we sometimes are exceptional in nature as well. It's just amazing to me, with like the ease, definitely with we can actually put a face on a certain type of evil, and another we have like very difficult, like we have difficulty even like setting terms for debate as well. Definitely reflects the terrible genius of like colonialism, of carcerality, supremacy, capitalism, and also like imperialism. So like one evil they can so clearly put a face on and to justify the most brutal solutions to, and the other is like mostly faceless, and it always acts out of like total impunity. So
if I can, pick up on one point there, I think it's important for people to realize also how these issues are framed in Singapore, which is, you talk about like these two faces, and one habit or trend or the way that the PAP government thinks in Singapore is to frame things in terms of that impunity, right? And to terrify us that there are people who are either doing wrong and getting away with it or trying to break the system, and they're there to stop it. But that means that when you think about these policies on a scale from, say, creating policies which are, on the one hand, more accessible to the public or more humane, right? Or easier to understand. The PAP never approaches that side of the spectrum. They go towards the side of the spectrum where policies are very harsh and complicated, because their fear is always that if they're not on that side of it, if they're more towards the humane and accessible side, there's going to be loopholes that people fall through. There's going to be a crime committed that's going to make the government look bad. There's going to be some sort of exploitation of the system. And that's part of the broader idea, right, that the PAP has, which is that that it actually encouraged us to have, right? I think the Prime Minister said, if you're not eating other people's lunch, they're eating our lunch, right? And which is a terrible, terrible idea, the idea that we can't all work together in a community. But the broader concept is someone is always trying to screw over the system. And in Singapore, there's this idea, if you're not screwing over the system or screwing over other people, you're the one getting screwed over. Well, that's something like that, right, which we call kiasuism, actually is very insidious, because you look at the broader policies, and that means that policies are always written so that they want people not to be able to screw them over. So if you look at CPF, they make it more and more complicated so you can't exploit it. But that means people who honestly just want their pension money for whatever reason can't access it. You look at housing, right? Very complicated. Over the years, what became, housing for the people has now become all these different schemes. You look at healthcare, right? All these different schemes, so that what used to be, we used to have universal, virtually free healthcare. Now it's all these subsidies, schemes, everything very complicated. But then again, with all our laws, and again you come back to abolition, it's the same thing. You make everything so complicated and you make it difficult to access, and that means that a lot of people then end up getting screwed over by the system because they don't have the ability or the time or the energy to navigate all the different aspects of the law. But instead, what you have is a law written to entrap and narrow and close down all these loopholes, and it becomes inhumane almost, right? Or the same thing about election law. They're so afraid of fraud that they narrow the right to vote. We don't even actually technically have the right to vote, but they narrow the vote to as few people as possible to ensure that there's no fraud, when there's been virtually no instance of fraud at all in our entire electoral history. But they write the law so that it's all the way over to this avoid fraud side, rather than trying to guarantee as much access and the universal right to vote, to all Singaporeans. So this is another way of looking and thinking about how we write laws, how we create policies, that I think people don't realize it. And that's why when you talk about abolition, we talk about any law, one of the first responses, knee-jerk almost, I get is, oh, but then people are going to exploit it, if you don't have this harsh law, right? People are going to exploit it. If you don't do this, that, if you don't make the law so tough, if you don't create punishments which are really tough, people will exploit it, without even thinking about the sheer cost of this attitude and the fact that there's a lot of innocent people, right, who are going to be caught up in it because of the sheer complexity and weight of the law.
Yeah, I really love that point, right? That carcerality or the carceral logics that we live with are entrenched with many other different logics, right? Logics of screwing people over and getting screwed over. So I really, really love that point. But I want to kind of bring in and jump off of that point, right? And kind of bring in a very common response to abolition politics, right? And so I'm thinking, from the perspective of somebody in the Facebook comments, right, writing on Verso Books or Jacobin or something like that, on an article about abolition, and they'll say, let's say I can get behind the idea that we need to let go of the carceral logics, we need to let go of the kiasuisms, right, and we need to come up with new ideas on how to make the prison system less brutal, less violent, right? But then they will add in, but where do we put the rapists and murderers? Where do the Jeffrey Dahmers and Jack the Rippers go, right? And isn't it okay if we enforce, strong rule of law in order to keep us safe from these irredeemable psychopaths? What do you say to that?
Yeah, so there's always like this massive assumption that most mass murderers or those who like committed a lot of like extreme violence are the ones in prisons, are the ones who locked up. But that is actually not the case, because in Singapore, for instance, if we look at like rape cases as well, only about like a little over 13% led to conviction, and rape cases even reportedly up by approximately like 75% since the past few years. And a lot of people don't go to jail for it. They are like, wandering among us, living among us. And many people think that also like sexual assault, which is considered as this very monstrous act, is something abolitionists haven't worked out, when it's actually very central to abolitionist work and theorizing. Especially, we know that it is a simultaneous side of anti-colonial, anti-racism, gender essentialist, and queer liberation as well, practiced by survivors. And we know as well, like rape is something that's massively underreported, because a lot of like survivors have to go through like this traumatization when they report to the police. So a lot of people who go, even the very little people who like got convicted for it, like they go out and sometimes they committed the same offense as well. And I'm also saying this as a survivor as well. Like I believe abolition is a fragile trust, in a sense that vested in the world by survivors who actually won, and we need and demand that harm be met with community care rather than very harsh punishments, in a sense that it is definitely a lot of things, but easy is not one of them. No one tells you that abolition sometimes can be a very lonely fight. The very important thing that we have to know is that we cannot just force upon solutions, especially for survivors, and when we look back, I would say personally, touching a bit on my childhood, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I was a kid, if I did something wrong or if I misbehaved for some time, and the guardian would just say, hey, stop doing that, I'll just call the police is gonna catch you if you misbehave. So there's this a lot of carceral mindset that has been planted to us from a very such an early age, and that's why these punitive logics of capitalism, it have infiltrated even our emotional landscapes. And it pushes us towards wanting to harm in response to being harmed. That's why this continues the cycle, and that's why a lot of people also come up with where do these murderers, where do these violent criminals go? But if they are more sort of like they have accessibility to like a lot of resources, some people can get away with a lot of crimes. So a lot of like rich people who have like the who have like a high social class and status, like they have a lot of this get away in terms of crime and like criminal acts and stuff. So we can actually like think about accountability and transformative justice as well, like without relying on punishment, which only recreates a lot of these structures of oppression. So I would say like when we actually like challenge racism, when we challenge like patriarchy, these are all like the key to the creation of like the society where prisons are simply sometimes can be unnecessary, because we have a lot of like communities being able to like bring about justice when harm is done. And I would just like to bring up like something Mariam Kakba actually say as well, like everything worthwhile is done with other people as well. And I think that abolition sounds like a pipe dream, because like it is demanding like a really fundamental restructuring of society away from like the racially consumptive and punitive, and that is very hard. You know, like there maybe there are like clearer paths or plans on some fronts, but not on some others, because that is the nature of the project. That is the nature of the abolitionist project. People are offering a lot of like analytical frameworks as well, and plans and strategies, and some things like they don't have like a singular answer. So the ease of like offering that answer is not like to the point, and that's why people choose to like refute it, and they don't want that work. They just want like the answer, and they want like the familiarity of structure. So that is why this project is a little antithetical, I say, to like prefect politics, and frankly that's what like makes it so ambitious and exciting, but it's also terrifying, because an anti-carceral approach in return, it sort of like tells you and asks you to free yourself from this thinking, to interrogate your carceral impulses, and to even to those who have like violated the more standard parts of your existence. And I definitely can see like the I would say like fuzzy edges of a world without prison bars, one where minoritized people like they don't carry the burden of incarceration. So I don't think I'm alone in this, for sure. Like many I would say like even like queer bisexual women who have survived like sexual assault, physical violence, stalking by like a partner, or a lot of the combination of this, like many people believe that a lot of like people deserve to heal in the face of this sort of like inescapable cycle of state-sponsored violence. We choose mediation, like we choose our communities and a different path further than the one that's always available. And many of the most like adamant abolitionists, I say, also are survivors of violence, and they when I speak to a lot of these people as well, they insistently like refuse on understanding justice beyond the punitive logics of the carceral state, because even convictions are tested constantly, because the state does not produce justice. And one of the most important thing, like I've mentioned earlier as well, in responding to such cases, like in terms of even sexual assault, is to never judge or impose solutions ever, especially towards a survivor. And then you have also like people using like the existence of pedophiles, for instance, right, like as their gotcha on like abolition, as if like there weren't so many youths globally being kept in adult jails and prisons. They are made to be more extra vulnerable to the predatory like violence people claim to care about. So this shows some of this, like, yeah, the people commenting on like Facebook and stuff, like they don't actually care about the victims of childhood sexual assault. They just love to use the horror spectacle that's made for their plan to uphold the system that also victimizes thousands and thousands of children every day. So prisons breed a lot of abuse culture. They also like create worse conditions for survivors when abusers actually get out. So what happens then? If they ever went, most don't. Like they need mental health professionals as well, not the carceral state, because you're not tackling the issue. The crime is gonna be committed again and again because of that. And if we truly want to reduce or even end like this gender-based violence, you know, like putting a few perpetrators in prison does little. We have to hold the individual like perpetrator like accountable as well. We have to go through like their transformation, or to the most important thing is like to meet the needs of the survivors, to meet the needs of the people who are harmed by these individuals. And I just don't think, and many people don't think, that prisons can address like this gender-based violence, since prisons are themselves like the central organizers of gender-based violence. You know, like my status, I'd say, like as a survivor of intimate violation, it placed me firmly sometimes like in the paradox of abolition, you fighting for the freedom of someone who had trapped me from like a singular monstrous act. And also mentioned this earlier as well, like too often we sort of like as in truncate what is the abolitionist response to this very monstrous crime or like situation. These are all like created by current material conditions. You know, sometimes we don't have like a singular way, like we can't, but we have to transform these conditions that produce these situations in the first place, like the framing I just mentioned earlier on. And this is a good time to just like bring about like what Ms. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said, like abolition means not just the closing of prisons, but the presence instead of vital systems that support that many communities lack. And abolition will demand that we actually believe in safety when it's been taken from us. It asks us to sort of like build the bridges, you know, out of our own isolation. And most of all, it definitely requires that we have faith and trust that something or anything lives on the other side of that pain. And if I could bring about like some maybe like lived experience as well, having worked in the criminal justice system for a few years, I can say that sometimes I do believe that an abolitionist society would probably prevent like some of these cases litigated like from ever reaching to that point, because carcerality and capitalism fuel a lot of them, which can only be saved through the restoration of human, social and economic relations, which are not destructive to all forms of life. You know, I know this is not something that everyone is very keen to believe in, because it can sound quite radical, but we are actually talking about the very dual project. Like on the one hand, yes, to dismantle like death-making institutions such as policing and prisons, and creating life-affirming ones. So putting resources and investing in things that do actually keep people safe, sort of housing, like healthcare, schooling, all kinds of things, like living wages so people don't actually resort to crime. And those types of investments are what keep people safe. And so this a lot of like abolitionist thinking as well fuel is very relevant with the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis cops. Like it was another horrific and very needless death. You know, it's another unarmed black man killed by police and recorded for all the world to see. It was also a spectacle of violence at the hands of the state that we witnessed. And we've seen this before, like literally we've seen it, like a lot of like marginalized people, especially like black men, being choked by police in broad daylight, the uprisings like against the carceral state, police and prisons, and pictures that prove that torture is going on in these institutions of criminal punishment. You know, and we see the police are most likely not held accountable. They don't get fired, they don't get charged, and the very few cases where they do get charged, like it's extremely rare for them to be convicted.
So I want to kind of bring it back to Singapore a little bit, right? And even preempt some of the comments that I kind of foresee coming out, right? So I'm sort of preempting a response here, right? What if someone were to say, you know, that's America, right? In Singapore, we have strong carceral system, we have strong law and order, right? Maybe it's a bit harsh, but it works. We've got low crime rate, people are safe. And in the famous words of our ministers, you know, you can walk on the street at night completely fine, which you can't say about somewhere like New York, right? So what would you say to a response like that?
Okay, so in the context of Singapore, we have really, really great initiatives like Transformative Justice Collective, Singapore, who are advocating for like the abolition of the death penalty. And we know, like, coming back to the question, how Malays and Indians are disproportionately overrepresented in prisons, and they are also very less likely to achieve reintegration as compared to the Chinese counterparts. Recently, there was a report which is very beneficial to like bring forth as well, like how 17 ethnic Malay individuals are facing the death penalty in Singapore, and they actually have brought forth a judicial review to the courts on the basis that the Attorney General's chambers have acted arbitrarily and in a very discriminatory manner for imposing the death penalty on them because of their race. There was this strong emphasis on systemic discrimination, which is an issue in Singapore as well, and you can't deny that systemic discrimination isn't an issue in Singapore, because if you do deny that, then I don't think like we're living in the same country sometimes. Like, this is why I believe that prison is a racialized space where human rights, especially for marginalized people and humanity, are suspended. So to have this racialized space is also to have a form of containment that subordinates racial minorities in the context of Singapore, like Malays and Indians, and the ways like said minorities sort of cope and resist, as well as we see from the report. With spatial containment, you always have to have a racial politics when it comes to dismantling tools of oppressions, regardless if you're living in Singapore, regardless if you're living like other places beyond Singapore as well. Like, nobody is demanding you to choose a struggle by supporting like marginalized people's liberation, because abolition itself, like, it's fighting against violence, and the violence of capitalism is not singular. And we have, even in Singapore, to move beyond the heavy reliance of a very racialized and punitive justice system that we have now. There was also this really good informative and comprehensive report on National University of Singapore Malay Studies alumnus Siti Hazira Muhammad paper on how Malay youth delinquency as well is portrayed in Singapore media through television shows like Anak Metropolitan. And I actually grew up watching this show, so it portrays like social and personal problems of Malay teens, which led them to criminal behavior. A lot of the times, people associate like drug issues with Malays. Like these shows actually explores their upbringing, their peer group, and socio-economic background, how they actually play an important role in shaping the choices that they make. So there was this heavy association of Malay youths with drug addiction, with broken families and delinquency. It has been a feature of Singapore politics as well since it's emergent as an independent nation. There's this narrative has been much dominated and sustained even by like a lot of political elites, a lot of scholars. It perpetuates this stereotype that ethnic Malays, that minority Malays in this country, they lack like socio-economically as an outcome of their own inept like cultural values and attitudes, when they also are victims of like state abandonment. They've not been given resources for them to actually get out of this very oppressive like conditions, and problems such as homelessness, of teenage pregnancy, of like drug addiction, and low income families as well. Youth delinquency are frequently referred to and been widely framed as the Malay problem, or we say like masalah Melayu. Dr. Lily Zubaida Rahim, I think, she has argued that beyond purely like cultural endorsements of multiculturalism, the construct of race in Singapore, it has posed challenges to minorities on an institutional level, and has rendered like the idea of like meritocracy a very questionable one, for sure. So the government's like aversion towards like call in the 1970s or the 1980s by Malay elites and key community leaders to uplift the Malay community in terms of educational attainment has actually directly disadvantaged the Malay minorities. So the position of like the Malays and their weak cultural values, like our undesirable attitude, are then pinpointed as the source of our own shortcomings and as the reason like behind their persistent entrenchment within the poverty cycle as well. The alumnus like Siti Hazira has said something very important as well, like in placing the blame for their current condition on the Malays themselves. Like this also like negates the possibilities of structural inequalities as a possible factor in the lives of Malays who are deemed as dysfunctional. So such narratives, when they're being brought upon in a very national audience into the public sphere, even in national day rally speeches and other avenues of communication, like through which the government relates to its people, and they just like how even our Prime Minister as well, like Lee Hsien Loong, he has said something, I'm not sure if it's like in 2005 or 2009, but he said something that how it has continuously and consistently raised the specter of problematic and later dysfunctional young Malay families as a factor that is hindering the Malay community from progressing in tandem with other like communities as well. So I'd say a lot of the issues in Singapore, we have to also take an internationalist approach towards abolition. We have to also, it can't say, what's happening in like America, it doesn't affect us at all. But it's also a form of like collective freedom and liberation that you have to care about. Like Black Lives Matter, you still have to care about as well in the context of Singapore.
So
and if I can add, right, on top of race blaming, right, on top of the whole logic and framing that I talked, the Gyasuism, right, where what happens if one person who conducts a crime is not caught, right? That whole spectrum I talked about earlier between accessibility and sort of locking things down to avoid loopholes. There's also a false dichotomy here, right? So someone, John, who writes, what if, they're assuming that safety and human rights are mutually exclusive. That safety and caring and building a society which cares for everyone, which treats all of us with mutual respect, with trust, with decency, these are mutually exclusive. They're not, right? And we see very interesting attempts all around the world to build societies which are both safe and which also protect human rights and have mechanisms where we can talk about very difficult issues, where we can talk about discrimination on the basis of race or gender, where we can try and protect the rights, even the rights of prisoners, because prisoners, everyone deserves human rights and deserves the basic human decency, right? And we can see that clearly in the thriving human rights communities and attempts to build better societies in places like Taiwan or Japan or South Korea. It's not even Western, right? We have these things nearby in society, some of which are very similar to us. So this false dichotomy, I think, is a huge problem. And I would turn it around and say, I think the bigger problem is also people, and I don't want to blame everyone, but I think there's a lot of people who are who want easy answers, and building an advanced civilization, an advanced society is not easy. Writing a law and just saying, everyone falls under that law and no exceptions, right? That means you don't have to take responsibility, and actually that's also part of it. People are afraid of doing the hard work, but they also don't want to take responsibility. And it's easier to simply throw that responsibility to a harsh, unyielding government and just saying, the law is the law is there. If you do the crime, you got to do the time, and these are very lazy ways of looking at our individual and collective responsibility to our society. And if we want better societies, which are actually sophisticated and can treat all of us with the dignity and respect while recognizing that we're all different, we all need to work for that, but that is very difficult.
Yeah.
And I think people are afraid, they're tired, they're frustrated. We're in a world where we're ground down by capitalism. And so I don't want to say people are lazy, but I will say that because of the circumstances around us, grinding us down, on top of capitalism, we now have a pandemic, we have climate crisis, people are exhausted. And to think of, like, on top of that, I got to put in the work to build a better society. I can understand a lot of people just like, you know what, forget everyone else, I'm in this for myself, screw it. But we're not going to advance as humanity that way. We're going to go back to the way of the caveman, which is, who might makes right, which it's not.
And I just want to echo and sort of summarize Hanny's point, because I think it's extremely beautiful that when people say there's nothing wrong with carcerality because look at Singapore, it's so safe, right? And I think what Hanny did there, right, in her very thorough answer, is remind us, safe for whom, right? It's not safe for the minorities. It's not safe for the teens who are a little bit brown. I can attest to this, right? Where the police come and spot check you. It's not safe for people who are in these very precarious positions, exposed to very precarious positions where they have to choose survival and comfort or going to jail. So I really, really love that point. And I think that makes a very, very strong case for abolition in Singapore. But beyond just making the case, how do we begin to move toward abolition in Singapore? How can we begin imagining what abolition would look like in Singapore, right? We seem very far away from it, I have to admit, right? PJ's been through it, I've been through it. Every time, we get investigated, everybody in the comments is like, go to jail, lock them up, life imprisonment, right? We are really in love with the police and jail for some reason. How do we begin to move toward abolition in Singapore?
All right, so it is definitely what you say. We are so far removed from like a lot of like the realities of being like an abolitionist society. Definitely, because how we are going to start. A lot of work has to be done with our own self as well, like our cultural impulses, like I've mentioned earlier on, but also regardless, whether you want to get rid of prisons or simply make them less violent, if that's ever possible, an immediate humanitarian demand that we can make, I'd say, obviously through the abolition of the death penalty. To decarcerate people who are locked up for like non-violent offenses simply because they made certain choices they had to in order to survive the way they know that they can. So when there's less incarcerated people, there's also less opportunities for people to be brutalized by the state. The idea, I would say, is just like to gain this traction towards these voices, towards incarcerated people who are subjected to the most egregious state conditions, towards the marginalization of people who are subjected to all of this, and to support them towards better conditions. Even when these incarcerated people, who comes out of prison, they are not being supported with the right resources, and some people just sort of like dismiss a lot of like their needs and concerns as well. It can also like through all of this questioning and interrogating of ourselves and our own logical as in carceral punishment ideas that we have to respond harm with harm. It can also help us to ask better questions in the future, instead of like, oh, do prisons keep us safe? So that is how I would foresee, in a way. And I know like we have such a long way to go, but decarceration is important as well.
So for those viewers out there who are interested in abolitionism in Singapore, right? What are some books or texts or resources that you can point them to? And also for those who are interested, how can we get involved? How can we sort of make our voices heard or aid the cause here?
All right, so there are a lot of resources on abolition. A very good start would be by as in through reading the works of Angela Davis as well. Prisons are obsolete. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has a lot of abolitionist work that comes out. But if people want to see comprehensive resources as well, there's this. There's this website. It's called criticalresistance.org/resources. It lays out the stuff that you can actually read and get involved with when you want to start thinking about abolition. So there's also a recent book that came out by Marian Kapba. It says We Do This Till We Free Us, which is a very important book as well. And there are collectives in Singapore, we've mentioned, like Transformative Justice Singapore, who advocates for the for the abolition of the death penalty. Can start with that, and also to bring forth a lot of compassion towards other human beings. That is also something that I find. I would not say funny, but interesting, because some would say all of this prison abolition, it's so radical, it's so utopian, why are you believing in this, it's not going to happen in Singapore, it's not going to happen everywhere else. People say these are radical politics, but they also come from a very vulnerable place as well, one that is rooted in love, in empathy, in compassion towards other humans. Things are not okay right now, and it hasn't been okay, and many of us just want people to be okay, and that can be radical to some as well. And people who do advocate for prison abolition, I've seen a lot of people also hate on them a lot, because they are just some annoying contrarian who just shit talks for the sake of it, but it's not.
Yeah. All right, so on that note, Hani, I just have one last question for you, right? And it's a question that we ask all of our guests. Basically, what is your theory of change, right? On a personal note, how do you think change can happen? How do you think it should happen? How do you think it would happen or will happen in the future? What is your take on the things that you believe that you can do in your own way to make change happen?
Okay, so to me, of course, abolition is a theory of change reflecting a holistic commitment to build a more just world for everyone. So it's a theory of social life, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it. We found this in approach, we found in this approach also, it has informed my theory of change during the pandemic, especially when people face a lot of structural barriers. Helping the most vulnerable people requires a lot of bold changes, and it's not just tweaks at the margin. So more people should be interrogating, more people should be questioning, more people should be dismantling our ideas of punishment as an approach to harm, and we have to be accountable a lot for our actions as well. And also, I would say I would bring back to my previous point, because ultimately, regardless of what we see, how we view state power, if we want to make prisons less violent and stuff like that, decarceration is how I see we as a society move forward. So it is, to me, an immediate humanitarian demand as well. So we can't just keep people locked up in all of these cages with inhumane conditions, and also very secluded from the rest of the world sometimes.
So on that note, Hani, I want to thank you so much for coming onto the show and explaining to us and really exposing the issue of abolition, not just from an Islamic perspective, but also situating it in Singapore, providing that relevance for all of us. So thank you so much for coming onto this show. Thank you so much, PJ, for having me. It's been amazing, yeah.
Thank you so much for having me as well.
Yes, thank you, Hani. Really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you for coming on the show. Thank you, Sean, for, as always, excellent co-hosting and questions. And thank you to you, our listener or viewer, if you're watching this on YouTube, for joining us today. As always, if you've enjoyed this, please do join New Narrative as a member. We desperately need your support. You can go to newnarrative.com/join to join, or newnarrative.com/donate to donate. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about New Narrative, please check out this playlist up here. And if you'd like to watch episodes of Political Agenda, please check out this playlist down here. Thank you very much, and please help keep New Narrative sustainable and independent by joining as a member at newnarrative.com/join. Thank you.